I never told my son about the property in Marlow County. Not once in 32 years. Not when he graduated from college. Not when he got his first real job. Not even when he sat across from me at the kitchen table after his mother passed and asked me, with red eyes and a voice that cracked at the edges, whether I was going to be okay financially. I looked at my son that night, and I said, "Don't you worry about me." And I meant it in more ways than he understood. My name is Walter Grayson. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer for the state of Tennessee. And before that, I spent 4 years in the Army, which is where I learned that the most important battles are the ones you win before the other side even knows the war has started. My wife, Eleanor, understood that better than anyone. She was a high school English teacher for 26 years. People who met her at church or at neighborhood cookouts always said she was the warm one, the gentle one, the one who remembered every birthday and kept a tin of homemade shortbread on the counter for anyone who came through the door. All of that was true. But Eleanor also had a mind like a steel trap, and she had a habit of watching people very carefully before she decided what she thought of them. She never said an unkind word about anyone without cause. But when she made up her mind, she did not change it. She made up her mind about my son's wife before the engagement was even official. Our son Daniel was 31 when he met Tara Hollins. He was an architect working for a mid-size firm in Nashville, doing well enough, living in a decent apartment in East Nashville, saving money the way I'd raised him to. He was careful with money. He drove a 4-year-old Honda that he'd paid cash for. He brought his lunch to work 4 days out of 5. I was proud of how he'd turned out. Genuinely proud, not the kind fathers perform for other people. He met Tara at a rooftop party hosted by someone he barely knew. She was 28, recently relocated from Atlanta, working what she described as freelance brand consulting, which I later came to understand meant she had a laptop and a social media account and no steady income to speak of. She was beautiful in the way that immediately puts a certain kind of man off his footing: dark hair, easy laugh, the particular skill of making whoever she was talking to feel like the most interesting person in the room. Daniel called me 2 days after they met, and I could hear it in his voice immediately. That particular vibration of a man who has decided something before he's had time to think it through. Eleanor heard it too. She was sitting across from me at the dinner table when I put the call on speaker, and I watched her face while Daniel talked about Tara, and I saw something move behind her eyes that I recognized. It was the same look she'd given me in 1987 when I told her I was thinking about going into business with my college roommate, and she'd said, very quietly, "Let's think about that a little longer." We thought about it a little longer, and 6 months later my college roommate's business had collapsed, and he'd taken 3 investors down with him. Eleanor said nothing that night on the phone. She just listened, and afterward, when I set the phone down, she picked up her tea and said, "I'd like to meet her." We met Tara for the first time in October of that year at a restaurant in Nashville that Daniel had chosen. She arrived 12 minutes late, apologized with the practiced ease of someone who has never genuinely worried about being late in their life, and spent the first 20 minutes asking Daniel questions about the firm he worked for and how large the projects were, and whether he was on track for partnership. She did it pleasantly, conversationally, but Eleanor caught my eye once across the table, and I gave a small nod that meant, "Yes, I see it too." Tara asked me what I'd done before retirement. When I told her I was a civil engineer for the state, she smiled and said, "Oh, that's wonderful. Steady work." The emphasis on steady was barely perceptible, but it was there. On the drive home, Eleanor said, "She's already calculating." I said, "Maybe she's just practical." Eleanor looked out the window at the highway lights. "Practical people calculate what they can build," she said. "She's calculating what she can take." Eleanor was diagnosed 14 months later. Ovarian cancer. Caught later than any of us wanted. She lived 2 years and 4 months from diagnosis. In that time, she did 3 things that I didn't fully understand until much later. She asked me to take her to see Harold Kemp, who had been our attorney for 20 years, on 3 separate occasions without Daniel knowing. She asked me to pull out every document we'd accumulated over 35 years of marriage deeds, account statements, insurance policies, investment records, and go through them with her at the kitchen table on a series of Sunday afternoons. And she asked me, in the last real conversation we had, when she was still herself, to promise her that I would not tell Daniel about the Valley property until I was certain, absolutely certain, that the time was right. I promised her. The property in Marlow County was 46 acres of land in a river valley about 2 hours east of Nashville, up in the hills near the Cumberland Plateau. Eleanor's father had bought it in 1968 for almost nothing. He'd intended to retire there, build a small house, grow a garden. He died in 1991 before he ever broke ground. The land passed to Eleanor, and Eleanor held it for years, paying the property taxes quietly, visiting it once or twice a year to walk the perimeter and stand at the edge of the creek that ran through the lower field. She never talked about it much. It was hers in a private way, connected to her father and her childhood, and something she didn't need to explain to anyone. When the diagnosis came, she and Harold Kemp put the property into a revocable living trust. The trust named Daniel as sole beneficiary. There was language in the trust documents that was precise and deliberate about what constituted marital property and what did not. Harold had done this many times before, and he was thorough. The property was effectively invisible to any future claim from a spouse existing or future against Daniel's assets. It had been Eleanor's inheritance, and it had been structured accordingly. I was the trustee. Eleanor died on a Tuesday morning in March, with Daniel and me on either side of her. She had been unconscious for 2 days by then. When it was over, Daniel put his head down on the side of the bed and cried in a way I hadn't heard since he was a small boy, and I sat very still and put my hand on his back and thought about how much she had loved him and how much work she had quietly done so that love would outlast her. Daniel and Tara got engaged 8 months after Eleanor passed. I won't pretend the timing didn't concern me. Daniel was grieving, and Tara had become very present in that grief, always available, always attentive, very good at occupying the space that loss creates in a person. I understood what was happening, and I said nothing because Eleanor had told me once, early in the illness, that warning a man away from a woman he loves is the surest way to make him run toward her. What I did do was call Harold Kemp. The prenuptial agreement Harold drafted was not punitive. It was fair and clear. It protected Daniel's assets acquired before the marriage and any assets he might inherit. And it specified that in the event of divorce, within the first 10 years, Tara would be entitled to a percentage of jointly acquired assets, only nothing that predated the marriage, nothing that came through inheritance or gift. Harold put it plainly, this is boilerplate in a lot of states for second marriages. For a first marriage with an asset disparity, it's just prudent. I told Daniel I wanted him to have a prenup. I expected resistance. What I got was a long silence on the phone, and then, Dad, she's going to think I don't trust her. I said, the purpose of a prenup isn't distrust. It's clarity. It protects her too, if things go wrong. Daniel said he'd think about it. 3 weeks later, he called back and said Tara had signed it. He said she'd been totally cool about it, which should have been a relief, but was instead, to me, slightly more unsettling. In my experience, people who are entirely relaxed about signing away potential financial claims have either already decided the document is unenforceable or have already identified other angles they haven't closed yet. The wedding was in June. It was held at a venue outside Nashville that I will describe as significantly beyond what the occasion required. Tara had a vision, Daniel had told me, and the vision cost approximately $94,000. I will let that number sit there for a moment. $94,000 for a one-day event. There were flowers that had been flown in from somewhere. There was a band and a DJ, apparently simultaneously. There was a photo booth, a dessert bar, a late-night taco station, and a videographer whose sole job was to follow Tara around and capture her reactions to things. Daniel paid for about a third of it from savings. I contributed what I had agreed to contribute, which was a figure significantly below a third. Tara's parents contributed nothing, a fact Daniel mentioned only once, briefly, and then never again. I danced with my son at his wedding and tried to be present in it. I shook hands with people I didn't know. I watched Tara move through the room, and noticed how she worked at the right word for every person, the careful attention to whoever seemed most worth attending to. She was very good at it. I'll give her that. What I noticed most, though, was a small moment late in the evening. I was standing near the bar with a glass of water when I saw Tara in conversation with a woman I didn't recognize. Tara was talking, and at some point she tilted her head and said something that made the other woman's eyes go wide with interest. Then Tara laughed and touched the woman's arm and glanced, briefly and deliberately, toward where Daniel was standing across the room. It was a fraction of a second, but it was the look of someone filing information, not enjoying a moment. I thought, Eleanor was right. The first year of the marriage was mostly quiet from my perspective. Daniel seemed happy enough, or at least busy enough that happy and busy were indistinguishable. They had moved into a house in a suburb south of Nashville, a house that was, once again, at the outer edge of what Daniel could comfortably afford on his salary, with a mortgage payment that I knew from a conversation with him left very little room for saving. Tara was not working. The freelance brand consulting had not materialized into anything consistent. She was taking a break to focus on settling in, which became exploring some new directions, which, after about 8 months, seemed to have settled into a steady state of not working at all. This was a topic Daniel did not raise with me directly, but I could hear it in the slight flatness that came into his voice when I asked how things were going. The particular flatness of a man who has made a decision he can no longer openly question. I visited them twice that year. The house was nice. Tara had decorated it with the kind of careful, aspirational style that costs more than it looks like it costs. She was warm to me during both visits, attentive in a practiced way, asking about my health and my garden, and whether I'd thought about traveling now that I had the time. She asked about my retirement income once, framed as concern, and I told her I was comfortable without giving her any numbers. I drove home from that second visit and sat in my own kitchen for a while in the quiet, and I thought about the Valley property and about Harold's trust documents sitting in the file cabinet in my office, and I thought about Eleanor at that restaurant table in Nashville, saying, she's calculating what she can take. I wasn't angry. I was something more settled than anger. I was ready. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in November, almost 2 years into the marriage. I was in my workshop in the back of the house, restoring an old Windsor chair I'd picked up at an estate sale, when my phone rang and Daniel's name lit up the screen. The first thing I noticed was his breathing, too fast. Dad. A pause. I need to tell you something, and I don't want you to. I need you to just listen for a second. I set down my sandpaper. I'm listening. Tara found some documents. Another pause. In my files. I don't know when she went through them. She found the trust documents, the ones from Grandpa's land. I waited. She's been talking to a lawyer, Daniel said. She found out about the property in Marlowe County. Dad, she's saying that you've been hiding assets from her, from us. She's saying the trust was set up specifically to defraud her of marital property. I looked at the Windsor chair for a moment, at the pale wood where I'd sanded back through decades of old finish to find what was underneath. Dad, are you still there? I'm here, I said. She wants to have a meeting. She wants you to come down this weekend. She wants to go over, she called it, full financial disclosure of family assets. Those were her words. His voice had something in it I recognized as shame, and something else I recognized as the beginning of his understanding that he had married someone who used phrases like that. All right, I said. I'll come down Saturday. There was a pause. Dad, I'm sorry. I don't know what she's thinking. I told her the land was Mom's, that it was in a trust before we even got together. But she, Daniel, I kept my voice even. Don't apologize. I'll see you Saturday. I called Harold Kemp on Friday morning. Harold listened without interrupting while I told him what had happened, and when I finished, he said, "Good thing Eleanor was thorough." I said, "She always was." Harold told me exactly what to bring, and exactly what to say, and exactly what not to say. We talked for 40 minutes. When I hung up, I stood in my kitchen and looked out the window at the backyard, at Eleanor's rose beds, which I had continued to tend because I did not know how to stop, and I said out loud to no one, or to her, "You saw this coming from a mile away, didn't you?" I drove down to Nashville on Saturday morning, and arrived at Daniel and Tara's house at 11 o'clock as agreed. Daniel opened the door. He looked tired in a specific way, not from lack of sleep, but from the kind of sustained internal tension that wears down a person's face from the inside out. He was 33 years old, and for a moment in that doorway, he looked older. He hugged me. I held on for a second longer than usual. Tara was in the living room. She had set up the coffee table with what appeared to be printed documents and a legal pad with notes on it. She was dressed carefully, not casually, which told me she had thought about this conversation as a performance. She greeted me with a warmth that was approximately 2 degrees cooler than her usual warmth, which is to say, she greeted me with something that was trying to look like warmth. "Walter," she said, "thank you for coming down. I know this is a difficult conversation." I sat in the armchair across from the sofa. Daniel sat beside Tara. I noticed he was sitting slightly away from her, not touching, the way people sit when they've been arguing and haven't resolved it. "It doesn't have to be difficult," I said, "but I'd like to understand your concern." Tara had a way of tilting her head when she was about to say something she'd rehearsed. She did it now. "Walter, I think you know that Daniel and I are a family, and families don't keep secrets from each other." She let that land for a moment. I found the trust documents for the Marlow County property. 46 acres valued at, she glanced at her legal pad, over $400,000 based on current comparable sales in that area. I want to understand why this was never disclosed. I let the quiet sit for a count of 5. Old habit. Eleanor used to say I weaponized silence, and I never denied it. "That property belonged to Eleanor's father," I said. "Eleanor inherited it in 1991. Before Eleanor passed, she placed it in a revocable trust. Daniel is the sole beneficiary of that trust. I am the trustee." I paused. "What specifically would you like disclosed?" Tara's jaw tightened slightly. "We believe that, as Daniel's spouse, I have a right to be informed about assets that affect our household's financial position," Daniel said quietly, without looking up. "I didn't know about it either, Tara." "That's not the point," she said. The point, I said, gently but clearly, "is that this property is Eleanor's inheritance, structured as an inherited asset in a trust that predates your marriage by several years. Under Tennessee law, inherited assets held in trust are generally not considered marital property. Harold Kemp drafted the trust. He is available to answer any legal questions you or your attorney might have." Tara looked at me for a moment. Something moved behind her eyes. I recognized it as recalculation. "We're not trying to take anything," she said, and now her tone had shifted, softened, moved toward reasonableness. "We just feel that as a family we should be transparent about financial matters, especially when we're planning our future together." "I agree completely," I said, "which is why I want to be very transparent with you right now." I set my hands on my knees. "This property is in trust for Daniel. It has been since before you and he were together. It is not marital property. It cannot be claimed as marital property, and it will pass to Daniel as structured when the trust is dissolved, which will happen when I determine the time is right. Your name will not appear on it at any point. That is not a secret. That is simply how it is." The room was very quiet. Daniel was looking at the floor. Tara looked at me with an expression I had not seen from her before, the one underneath all the other ones. It was not warm. It was not calculating. It was something harder and more honest, and oddly, I respected it more than anything else she'd shown me. She said, "I see." She said it the way people say things when they mean the opposite, when they mean, "This conversation isn't over." She was right. It wasn't. The weeks after that Saturday were a particular kind of difficult that I will not minimize. Tara had retained an attorney, a woman out of Brentwood, who had a reputation for aggressive asset investigation in high-net-worth divorces. I know this because Harold told me, and Harold knew because the attorney had sent a formal letter requesting a full accounting of all assets held in my name that could be connected to Daniel. Harold responded with the trust documents and a very courteous 2-page letter explaining Tennessee inheritance law. Daniel called me twice in that period. The first call was strained. He was clearly under pressure at home, and I could hear Tara in the background at one point. Not her words, just the tone. He asked me, carefully, whether there was any way to add Tara's name to the trust or modify the structure. I told him no. I told him his mother had been very clear about the structure, and I intended to honor it. He was quiet for a moment, and then said, "I understand," and I believed him. The second call was different. His voice was different. "Dad," he said, "I owe you an apology." I told him he didn't. "I do," he said. "I've been going through some things in my head this week, about the wedding, about the house we bought, about how we've been spending money since we got married." He stopped. I kept telling myself it would even out, that things would settle down. But I've been looking at our accounts, and I'm Dad. We've spent almost everything I saved in the last 3 years. And her name isn't on anything except the checking account and the mortgage. Which means I didn't say anything. Which means she knew exactly what she was doing, he said. I let that sit. "You knew," he said. "Not accusatory, just tired." "Your mother knew," I said. "She was smarter than both of us." He made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else. "What do I do?" I told him to call Harold Kemp. Tara filed for divorce in January. The filing was what Harold described as aggressive in scope and limited in actual legal merit. It requested a full accounting of marital assets, sought to challenge the trust structure on the grounds of fraudulent concealment, and included a claim for significant spousal support based on Tara's argument that she had sacrificed career advancement to support Daniel's professional development, which was, and Harold used this word, creative, given that she had not worked in approximately 2 years. Harold was not particularly worried. He had seen this pattern before. The challenge to the trust was the centerpiece of Tara's attorney's strategy, and it was the piece most likely to fail, because Eleanor had been so careful and Harold had been so thorough. The trust predated the marriage. The property was clearly identified as inherited. The trust documents included explicit language about the separate property nature of the asset. There was no evidence of fraudulent concealment because the trust had been properly recorded with the county. When it was created, it was public record. Anyone who had thought to look could have found it. Tara's attorney had apparently found it by searching county records after her client had reported the discovery of the documents in Daniel's files, which raised an interesting question. What had Tara been looking for when she went through Daniel's files? And when had she started looking? Harold filed the appropriate responses and motions. I prepared the financial disclosures Harold asked for. I sat at my kitchen table on 3 consecutive Sunday evenings and went through documents the same way Eleanor and I had done together in this same kitchen in the last months of her life, and I thought about what she had understood about the future that I had only partially understood. She had not just been protecting the asset. She had been protecting Daniel from the particular harm that comes to a person when they believe they have been loved and then discover they have been appraised. The mediation was scheduled for a Wednesday in late March. Harold and I drove down together. He walked me through the likely sequence of events on the way and told me what to expect from Tara's attorney's approach. We sat in a conference room on the 14th floor of an office building in downtown Nashville. Tara was across the table with her attorney. Daniel was beside me with Harold. A mediator sat at the head of the table, a careful, neutral woman in her 60s, who had clearly done this many, many times. Tara looked composed. She was dressed expensively, more expensively than I'd ever seen her dress, which I noted because it was a kind of argument she was making without words. I am accustomed to a certain standard of living. She did not look at me when I came in. The session lasted 4 hours. Tara's attorney presented the trust challenge first, and Harold dismantled it methodically and without drama, citing the recording date, the inheritance documentation, the prenuptial agreement, and 3 Tennessee court decisions that had addressed nearly identical structures. It was, if I'm being honest, quietly satisfying to watch. Not in a cruel way. In the way that good preparation always satisfies the moment when the thing you built to hold actually holds. By the second hour, Tara's attorney had dropped the trust challenge and shifted to the spousal support argument. This was where things became a negotiation. Harold had prepared Daniel for a fair settlement on jointly acquired marital assets, the contents of the joint checking account, a portion of Daniel's retirement contributions made during the marriage, a sum representing Tara's transition costs. It was a number that Harold described as reasonable, and Daniel described as expensive, and I described as the cost of the lesson. At some point in the third hour, I watched Tara's expression change. It was subtle. She had come in with a certain kind of energy, the focused, forward-leaning energy of someone who believes the play they've drawn up will work. And over the course of the morning, that energy had shifted into something that was harder to name. Not defeat, exactly. Something more like the recognition that the structure she'd been planning against had been built by someone smarter than her and built a long time ago. She looked at me once, briefly, in the third hour. I met her eyes. I didn't look away, and I didn't make my face say anything. I just let her see that I was there and that I had been prepared. She looked away first. The settlement was reached in the fourth hour. Tara received what was fair and nothing that wasn't. The trust remained intact, entirely untouched. The prenup held. Daniel's professional assets, his firm equity, his savings predating the marriage, none of it went anywhere. We walked out of the building into a gray March afternoon. Daniel and I stood on the sidewalk while Harold hailed a cab. The city moved around us the way cities do, indifferent and continuous. Daniel said, "She never loved me, did she?" I thought about how to answer that. I thought about Eleanor and how she would have answered it with something true that was also kind, because she was better at that than I am. "I think she cared about you," I said. "I think she also cared a great deal about what your life could provide for her. And when she understood that the two things were separate, that caring about you didn't automatically come with access to everything she wanted, she chose the other thing." Daniel nodded. He was looking at the street. "Mom knew," he said again. "She watched Tara for about 45 minutes at a restaurant in Nashville," I said. "And yes, she knew." He made that sound again, the one that wasn't quite a laugh. "Why didn't she say anything?" I looked at Eleanor's son and thought about the long Sunday afternoons in the kitchen, the 3 visits to Harold's office, the conversation at the end when she'd made me promise. "She did say something," I said. "She just didn't say it to you." We drove back to my place because Daniel didn't want to go back to the house yet, to the half-packed boxes and the particular silence of a marriage that has ended. He stayed for dinner. I made what I make when I need to feed someone without thinking too hard. Roast chicken, roasted potatoes, the green beans Eleanor used to put up every summer from the garden, the last few jars of which I was working through slowly because I was not ready to replace them with store-bought. We ate at the kitchen table, the same table where Eleanor and I had spread out those documents, the same table where she'd said, watching Daniel's face light up when he talked about a woman she'd met once, "She's already calculating." After dinner, Daniel asked me about the property. Not to claim it, not to ask questions about the trust structure. He asked me what it was like. I told him. I told him about the valley, about the way it sits in a fold of the hills, where the light hits the creek in the late afternoon and makes the water look like it's full of something moving. I told him about Eleanor's father walking that land before Daniel was born, planning the house he never built. I told him about Eleanor standing at the edge of the lower field on an October morning about 6 years ago, not saying anything, just standing there in the particular quiet of a place that belongs to you not because you bought it, but because you were given it by someone who loved you. Daniel listened. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said, "Can we go see it sometime?" I said, "Whenever you want." He nodded. He turned his water glass in his hands. Outside the kitchen window, the yard was dark, and somewhere in the dark, Eleanor's rose beds were waiting for spring the way they waited every year, indifferent to everything except the return of warmth and light. "Dad," Daniel said, "I'm sorry I didn't listen better. Back when you first told me about the prenup, and before that, I think I knew something was off, and I wanted to believe what I wanted to believe." I told him that was what it was to be human, that even people who are careful get their judgment compromised by the thing they want to be true, that his mother had been the most perceptive person I'd ever known, and even she had been wrong about people before she got good at it, and she'd gotten good at it by paying attention for a long time. "She paid attention to Tara," he said. "She paid attention to you," I said. Tara was incidental. Your mother was watching to understand what you were walking toward. He looked at me. And she built something to catch you, I said. If you walked off the edge. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, quietly, the property, I said. The trust, the prenup I insisted on, Harold's careful language. All of it. I looked at my son across the table that Eleanor had chosen. In the house she had made a home. She started planning it before she was even diagnosed. I think she saw Tara, and she thought, if this goes wrong, Daniel needs to land somewhere solid. Daniel's eyes went bright for a second. He pressed his lips together. She always thought about the landing, he said. She always thought about the landing, I agreed. We sat together in the kitchen for another hour without needing to talk much. I made coffee. Daniel found the shortbread I'd started making it myself about a year after Eleanor passed, from her recipe card, because the house felt wrong without the tin on the counter. We ate it in the comfortable silence of people who have been through something hard together and come out of it without being broken. Before he left, Daniel stood in the front doorway for a moment and looked at me. The property, he said. The trust. When does it dissolve? When does it become mine? I considered that for a moment. When you're ready for it, I said. That was the arrangement. I'm the trustee. I decide the timing. He nodded slowly. And when will I be ready? I looked at my son, 33 years old, tired in the honest way, standing in the doorway of the house he'd grown up in, asking the right question for the first time. I think sooner than you'd expect, I said. He hugged me at the door. Longer than usual, the way he'd hugged me at his mother's funeral, holding on to something. After the taillights of his car disappeared down the street, I went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a while. The shortbread tin on the counter. The rose beds in the dark outside. The file cabinet in the office, with Harold's trust documents in the third drawer. I thought about 46 acres of land in a river valley east of Nashville. I thought about a creek that caught the afternoon light. I thought about Eleanor's father walking the perimeter with his hands in his jacket pockets, imagining the house. I thought about Eleanor standing at the edge of the lower field in October, not saying anything. I thought about what she'd said to me in the kitchen, near the end, when she'd made me promise. She'd been sitting at this table with the documents spread around her, and she'd looked up at me with those clear, steady eyes, and she'd said, "The property isn't the gift, Walter. The protection is the gift. He'll understand the difference eventually." I understood it now. I think Daniel was beginning to. I turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. Somewhere 2 hours east, in a valley I had not visited in almost a year, 46 acres of hills and creek and old hardwood trees were sitting in the dark, held carefully in place, waiting for spring the same as everything else. Patient and intact, and entirely intact, the way Eleanor had intended, the way she'd built it to be.